Tēnā koutou katoa, kua hui hui mai I tēnei rangi. E mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. E mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua. Ko Ngāti Toa, ko Taranaki Whānui, ko Tiatiawa. No Peretania o Kutipuna, no te whanganui tara ahau. E noho ana ahau ki ahu mairangi. Ko Jean Raoa, ko Dave Ballantyne o Kumātua. Ko Kimberly, taku Tina, ko Ryan Orange, taku tāne. Tōko toru aku tamariki, ko Scout Monty Mimani nā ingoa, ko Angela Ballantyne, tōko ingoa. I mahi ana au I Otago whakaihu waka pōneke. I hei ahurangi mata tika koi ora ahau. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you so much for being here. It is so exciting to see you all. It's a funny thing, I think, as a sort of part of academia, that I get to be indulged with 45 minutes of talking about my life. There are so many people in this audience who I know their work is more difficult, more important, and often just as interesting as what I do. But unfortunately, tonight you have to listen to me rather than vice versa. One of the things I think I'm good at, there's actually lots of things in this talk that I'm going to say I'm not very good at, and that's going to really annoy my mum. So I need to name a few things that I am good at. One thing I am good at is pitching to an audience, right? Giving a specific talk to a specific audience. I don't think there are kind of generic audiences. So you guys present a very difficult problem because you're a very diverse audience, and it's really hard to pitch to, you know, a retired judge and an ex-school teacher and an expert in patent law and, you know, budding musicians and singers. So I will do my best. Let me turn this on. This whole event reminds me in ways of my wedding. So partly because the last time I actually had all you fabulous people, Alicia and Danny and my family and Ryan's family and all my girlfriends in the same room was at our wedding. And also because the last time I was really required to write a kind of personal and reflective piece was when I had to write my wedding vows. Now this does not bode well for anyone because my wedding vows were very, very bad. If you can imagine a very earnest 25-year-old philosophy student trying to think seriously about the kinds of statements they could truly make about their future selves. My wedding vows were along the lines of, given, nothing that starts with given is a good sentence, given the indeterminacy of personal identity over time, I cannot be sure that my future self will endorse the commitments I am making today. But if both of us remain reasonably consistent in temperament and values to our current selves, and if we experience only standard and not extraordinary hardships in our life, I think we have a plausible chance of an enduring relationship. But there was so much more. Now, the only saving grace is that when I finally got in the room and saw all of you amazing people and Ryan, I was so overcome with emotion that fortunately I cried through all the vows. This is me trying to look like I'm laughing when actually I'm just sobbing. And so no one could hear them, which saved me from a lot of embarrassment. I think the only person that actually heard them was Ryan, and it is a great credit to him that he said yes after all of that, nonetheless. But Ryan is a very brave person, and he loves a good challenge. Ryan gets called up by the UN, and they say things like, can you come and help us sort out Mongolia and Myanmar? At the moment, he's working trying to coordinate multiple agencies in the justice sector. So he is not afraid of a good challenge, and I sometimes think I was the most challenging of all of them. So my goals tonight are reasonably modest. I'm hoping to achieve a slightly more pragmatic balance between heart and head, and not to cry through the entire event. I want to just start by putting a few things on the table in terms of what I do in terms of my work. Because there's some of you here who I write papers with, and there's some of you here who probably have very little idea about what bioethics actually is. So bioethics is the study of ethical issues arising in the life sciences. So that's science, technology, medicine, and so forth. And I'll start with the green part. So in bioethics, there's three main areas of inquiry: research ethics, clinical ethics, and public health ethics. My true passion lies in research ethics, but because I am at the university, I work with a lot of colleagues in clinical ethics, so I've been sort of drawn into working on various of their projects. And then, of course, during COVID, everybody wrote about public health ethics. In particular, I was writing about equity and ICU access. Compared to a normal academic career, the topics up here are really disparate. There is a lot. A normal academic career over time narrows down into more and more specialisation. Bioethics, I think, is special. It's a relatively new discipline and it's interdisciplinary. So it facilitates a lot of flexibility of thought, but it also means you're often jumping around in and out of different disciplines and areas. And also, I'm very distractible. So that gives you an idea of some of the things I've written about. And I didn't put teaching on the board because teaching is relatively straightforward. I teach the lovely medical students here in years 4 and 5 and a little bit in year 6. The other component, as William said, of an academic career is service. I think I probably spend a disproportionate amount of my time on service, in part because there's a lot of demand for ethical input in various committees, and in part because I'm really interested in practical problem solving, more so often than the purely sort of theoretical work. So I like being on committees. They're not quite at the coal front in terms of being a scientist or a doctor, but they're one step closer to that coal front in terms of making practical decisions. So in sort of purple up the top, those are some of the groups that I've worked with in New Zealand, and down in the kind of pale blue, that's some of the international work I've done. So it ranges from issues around reproductive technology, surrogacy and abortion, issues around research. Particularly, I've looked at the exclusion of certain groups from research. That's a problem because the point of research is to produce knowledge which informs the healthcare of future patients, and to ensure that the healthcare you get when you go to the hospital is safe and effective. If groups like pregnant women or adults who can't consent are excluded from research, that directly undermines the quality of care they can receive. I've obviously done work around precision medicine, genomics and AI, and I've had a long-standing relationship with the International Association of Bioethics and the feminist approaches to bioethics. All right, so now you all know what I do. Okay, let's start at the beginning. These beautiful people are the beginning. These are my parents, Dave and Jean, and they got married in 1970, and they waited quite a while to have me. They were travelling overseas in London and Amsterdam. And in 1978, I came along, typical eldest daughter. This is me with my mother's parents and her side of the family. And I think my life really splits into like years 0 to 3 and then 3 and onwards. So years 0 to 3, I was living in Twizel because my dad was working for the Ministry of Works on some of the hydropower projects down there. And I had my mother all to myself. So the thing to know about my mother, there's many things, but in particular, she's very intentional. She's methodical and she's organised. She always has a plan. And as a good feminist, she knew that the personal was political, and if you want to change the world, you have to start at home. So part of her parenting plan was to raise me explicitly as a utilitarian. So that was the first 3 years of my life training. Now, for those that are less familiar with ethical theories, there's 3 ways you can think. Now, the medical students know this. I can hand over to you now. There's 3 ways of analysing an ethical problem and figuring out what you should do. You can analyse the consequences of the action, the nature of the action itself, or what that says about the agent taking the action. So if you're analysing the consequences, that's consequentialism, and a prominent form of that is utilitarianism, which says the right thing to do is make the decision that produces the best outcome for the greatest number of people. If you're interested in the action itself, that's a form of that is deontology, which is a rule-based reasoning system. Anything like human rights, religious tenets, bills of rights, civil liberties, those kind of rules of action focus on the action in question. The third form of reasoning is virtue ethics, and that focuses on the agent themselves. So what would this action say about the agent? And that focuses on wisdom and practical judgment. So if you've ever found yourself thinking, what would a good parent do in this circumstance? What would a good doctor do? That's a form of virtue ethics reasoning. So my mum was like, well, the way to change the world is if we all raised utilitarians, they would be less selfish and more altruistic. So this was going pretty well up until around 3 when I was in a race at kindergarten. and I was winning this race. But when I realised that I was winning, I stopped and paused and waited for everybody else to catch up. And the kindy teacher said to me, well, what was the problem? Did you not want to win? And I said, well, I did want to win, but I wanted everyone to win with me. And my mother thought, nope, 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 nope. Unintended consequences, change of plan. So from 3 onwards, we switched to feminism and women's empowerment as our primary ethical lens. Now, 30 years after I was born, I was one of the founding editorial board members for the International Journal for Feminist Approaches to Bioethics. So when I say my mum has a plan, I really mean my mum has a plan. So that was years 0 to 3. Now, if you were to ask someone to characterise my work in bioethics, there's a few things. They're not unique to me, but are kind of particular to the work I do. One is I'm quite interested in the context and particularities. I'm not as interested as at operating on a generic level. I'm really interested in fairness, so that's the thing that really gets under my skin. A lot of people in bioethics focus on agency and autonomy, or benefit and utility. For me, it's issues of justice and equity and fairness that really irritate me. So fairness would be the one. And the third thing would be a focus on trade-offs and being really clear about the fact that there's no perfect answers. So as part of this process, I was trying to think, where does that obsession with fairness come from? And as anyone in my generation, I thought there must be some secret childhood trauma that has occurred that has, I have yet not realised, but has resulted in my obsession with fairness. So I was thinking, what happened? What could have happened in my childhood that would lead to this? This is the arrival of my baby sister, Kimberly. And I thought, well, is it that? Is there some sort of sibling rivalry thing going on? But after much reflection, I'm going to get a drink of water. I have to say, I don't think that is the case. So Kimberly is my best friend, my ally in all things, my partner in crime. I love Kimberly so much that when we were children, I used to make her dress exactly like me so we could pretend to be twins. So I thought, no, she's not the source of all this. But the more I thought about it, I realised it's not just me who's obsessed and preoccupied with fairness. Actually, my whole family is preoccupied with fairness. And there are lots of examples I could give you, but I'm going to give you one example in particular. And this was like a big bang moment for me, like 6 weeks ago, when I was like, that is where it all starts. Like, it is exactly that rule we had as a kid that has run through all of the work that I've done subsequently. Oldest cuts, youngest chooses. Did anyone else have this rule in their family? Yes. Okay. So this actually comes, the history of this is from biblical texts about how to justly distribute resources. So in our family, every weekend, Dad would buy 1 chocolate bar. Now, it's only just occurred to me that he could have bought 2. But clearly that would have not made the purpose of teaching us this very critical rule. So oldest cuts, youngest chooses meant that me, as the eldest, with the finer motor skills, greater maturity, more cognitive development, was responsible for splitting the chocolate bar as evenly as I could, and then my sister, as the younger, more vulnerable party, got to choose which piece she wanted. Now, this has really significant similarities to famous philosopher John Rawls. So John Rawls is one of the greatest political philosophers of the last century. His work, A Theory of Justice, was the main work I used in my PhD thesis. And so Rawls has a couple of sort of theoretical steps. One, he says, so his interest is in how you set up the rules of society to be most just. And Rawls says, well, if you just got people to deliberate around a table, that wouldn't work because we all bring our own particular biases, right? Someone's going to be arguing from the position of a sick patient. Someone's going to be arguing from the position of someone that's inherited a massive amount of wealth. So we need to create a hypothetical model called the original position, where we do our deliberation behind a veil of ignorance, where we know a few things about people. We know what proportion of people have children with ADHD, what proportion of people get cancer, what happens when you imprison a parent, and so forth. But behind that veil of ignorance, before we know which cards we've been dealt, we need to make decisions about how we would justly structure society. And in particular, Rawls argues that under those conditions, we'd favour something called the difference principle, which is that we would favour equality in the distribution of resources and opportunities for all of us, unless an inequality raised the sort of living standards and the opportunities for everybody. So any inequality needs to be justified because it actually materially increases the position of the worst off. So my dad and John Rawls, two peas in a pod, though my dad was way more succinct, I have to say. What is it about this work and these ideas that have run through what I do? The first is the acknowledgement that human beings are imperfect and messy and biased. I think actually quite a lot of bioethics and sometimes our policy romanticises human nature. There's a lot of debate at the moment about introducing AI decision-making support tools in clinical practice. And the way we talk about that is we say, well, there'll always be a human in the loop. So even if you have this automated decision process, a human will always review that output, read it and check it, and the human is legally, ethically and professionally responsible for any decision that's made. I just think that's bollocks. Once people get used to automated systems, they will not read it, right? So you can have an entire regulatory system that says, well, it's fine because the human's responsible. But we know from all our social science research that automation bias and clinical de-skilling means that won't happen. So I'm always really interested in working with the pragmatic realities of humans. And actually, I really love the messiness of humans. I love that we are like self-deluded and contradictory and selfish. Like, I think that's really endearing. And we're always trying so hard with like such limited knowledge. I just think that's really lovely. So I'm like not at all interested in romanticising the rationality or the altruism of human decision makers. I think it's also really important to realise that when we come to decisions, we're coming to them with a background of often injustice. Sometimes that's really explicit and we can see it. Sometimes it's really subtle in terms of privilege and bias, and it's harder to see, but it's always there. And I do think some forms of bioethics ignore that at their peril. So for me, the key question across all my work is, how do you create rules that incentivise pro-social behaviour? So note that in Oldest Cuts, Youngest Chooses, it's not a lecture. The right thing to do as an older sister would be to voluntarily offer your baby sister the largest piece. It's saying, how do we set up the rule so that we align self-interest with pro-social behaviour? Take another example in relation to pharmaceutical companies. A lot of people say, well, pharmaceutical companies should just altruistically and charitably offer some of their essential medicines to patients in need. To me, I think that just doesn't make sense. Pharmaceutical companies are a business. We have set up a social system where we increasingly rely on private investment for research and development. Those companies are operating as businesses, competing for investment and capital. It's almost incidental that the product they happen to make is a health product. If we want those products to be more available, we need to change the rules, right? We don't need to lecture people about how to be nice. So that's a summary and an overview of the type of work I do. Now let me tell you something about how I work. So this is a photo of my son Monty, who requested a cow costume. Now, there's 3 lessons from this. The first is, always say yes. That has been a guiding principle across all of my work. Do not let the fact that you have no plan regarding how to execute the given task be an impediment to you saying yes. Say yes, and then you figure out the plan. Whether that's an overseas trip, whether that's booking a community theatre and you'll figure out how to put the show on later, whether it's a cow costume, whether it's an international agency rings you and is under the false impression that you're an expert in a given topic area, invites you to an international conference. It's like, I can be an expert in that topic area in 3 weeks. Absolutely. So the first is always say yes. The second is my creative or academic process is quite fluid and intuitive. And I think this is because I started, well, I am a little bit distractible, but I started in science and then I sort of switched into bioethics for my postgrad work, but I had no formal training in philosophy. And then bioethics is really interdisciplinary. So you're often having conversations with lawyers and then policymakers and then consultants and then people working in general practice, and you're having to kind of flick across those. So you've got to be able to get up to speed with topics quite quickly. So I don't like recipes. I don't follow patterns. I didn't look up a YouTube tutorial about how to make this cow costume. I just pinned the fabric on him and then sort of started cutting. And that's very similar to how I would do an academic paper. Now, these are my 2 PhD supervisors. No, not supervisors, markers, the 2 people that marked my PhD. This is from a conference last year. Alex London and Florencia Luna, and Alex made a comment in my PhD feedback, which has always stuck with me. He said, "This is the most intuitive account of exploitation I've ever read." And I love that because it's like simultaneously such a diss and such a compliment. It's such a diss because like your PhD is supposed to be reasonably structured and like well formulated, not intuitive. But it's also true, and I think one thing I'm quite good at is sometimes like putting my finger on the pulse of something, and so I really like that it landed with him on an intuitive level. Right, so the third lesson about how I work is vibes. Now, you might be thinking, why does he need to wear the cow mask in order for you to cut the cow pattern out? That has no direct impact on the quality of the cow costume. But you would be very wrong. Because when you're doing something in a very kind of fluid, organic, feel your way through it way, you have to be at one with the essence of cow, right? Like, you have to be in line with the vibe of the cow is what helps you manifest the cow costume out of almost thin air. It's the same with literatures. If you're bouncing around literatures really quickly and you need to get to grips with them, part of it is about reading the argument, but part of it is about feeling the vibe and the resonance of that literature. Some debates are really hot and angry, some are quite cold and analytical, some are dry, some are quite collaborative, some are really polarised. And it's not just about the arguments serve the underlying emotional content. And so being able to get in touch with both of those, I think, is really helpful, and it allows you to do it quickly. All right, so that's how I work. Let's tell you a little bit about my youth. Okay, so I grew up in Karori. I went to Karori West Normal School, and the 80s were a shocking time for fashion. I mean, I could give you a 45-minute talk on just these outfits alone, let alone the Cabbage Patch Kid. I think for my own sake, I was sent to a school with a uniform at that point. And so this is 3WT. This is my third form class. I am incredibly fortunate that many of my very dearest friends I met when I was 13. They are sitting here. Some of them are watching online. And that's incredibly lucky. There is nothing like old friends, friends you've had for a long time, who know you very well and couldn't care less whether you're successful or witty or anything. So I'm very grateful to have them in my life. Things I did at university and at high school, I did a lot of debating. So this is what debating looked like at high school. This is what debating looked like at university. But it was a lot of fun. That's my husband up there on the top of the pile with the long hair. My husband and I got together on New Year's Eve, 1998, in Syntagma Square in Athens, when we were there for the World University Debating Championships, which is like the geekiest love story possible. Debating taught me stuff. I think I learnt more in debating than I learnt through all of high school, and it taught me skills that I use every single day in relation to my work. Obviously, it taught me, I'll come back to that in a minute, how to think on my feet and fake being confident. But it taught me more important things about arguments. It taught me the difference between an aggressively asserted argument and a really good idea. And that is critical to disentangle and can often be really tricky. Often where we fall for the bluff that someone that is really loud and vocal and confident with their opinion must be so because they've got good arguments underpinning it. It's really useful to learn the difference between the performative art of speaking and the skills of critical reasoning and to distinguish those. It taught me that any argument worth thinking about has two sides and that therefore there are inherent trade-offs. There's no magic right answer that's going to get you out of that. You need to come to terms with the fact that there's trade-offs, and you need to own the fact that when you make decisions in the real world around ethics or policy, some people's interests are going to lose out, and you have to be okay with that. I often think that there's no, none of us are coming out of this with clean hands, right? We all have to take some responsibility, and that means getting our hands messy and being prepared to live with those consequences. It taught me that the audience is always right, or the adjudicator is always right. If your audience is bored, it is because you are boring. If the audience is confused, it is because you are confusing. You cannot stand there and say, well, technically, my argument was correct. There is a void between you and the audience, and as the person with the privilege of speaking, it is your job to deliver the message in a way that lands with the audience. It is not their job to try and interpret what you are saying. And it taught me finally that humans think in terms of stories. So often we're worried about like collecting all the data and all the evidence, and we think if we've got a big pile of it, that's going to convince someone. And I say this to the med students, they'll be familiar with this photo. You can get all your ethical arguments and your thoughts, but if you don't put them together in a structured narrative, you can't communicate to anyone, you're not going to convince anyone. You can get away with missing content and still create a picture that makes sense to people, but having all the content and no structure doesn't do you any good. So thank you. Are there any debaters in the room? Rob's in the room. Thank you, Rob and Ryan, other debaters, James and Antonia up there, for teaching me these things. Other things I did at university and at high school, I nannied a lot. So I had about 7 families I nannied for, some of whom are in the room today, and the parents of some of these children are in the room. That was really useful for 2 reasons. One, I said that I'm interested in the particular, I'm not that interested in the generic. It's a real privilege being let into the intimacy of other people's home life, and you often grow up thinking that, you know, how my parents did something or how my family operates is normal. When you bounce around in other people's families, you realise that actually every family is particular, and that really fine-tuned my thinking around that. It also helped me clarify that I really love children, and that for me it was more important to have children than to have a career. So that's what I mean about trade-offs sometimes. I knew that I was taking a step back when we got pregnant when I was at Yale, and a lot of academics said to me, "Oh, you're so young," and but that was really clear for me. I wasn't at all worried about that. I knew I wanted to have kids, and if I had the career, that was a bonus. So thank you for facilitating my bonus career, working, surprisingly well. So I had done my undergraduate degree was in science, but I realised quickly that I didn't have the patience and was not detail-oriented enough to really pursue science. And I was bouncing around nannying in London trying to decide what to do with myself. And this beautiful human being said, "Why don't you come to Melbourne and study something called bioethics?" And tell me if someone with that smile asked you that you wouldn't go. To be fair, I think it was more along the lines of, "Danny, what are you doing next year? What is bioethics? What's the course code? And can I sleep on the floor of the friends of the friends of the friends, in Melbourne?" So Danny, who's here today, very kindly facilitated my entry into bioethics. I was really lucky. The Monash Bioethics Centre is one of the leading bioethics centres in the world. As soon as I got there, I knew I'd found my people. We had evening meetings that were full of clinicians, people with a science background, philosophy students from overseas, and the conversations were so complicated and so interesting, and I loved it. I also met Jill and Alicia in Melbourne. You can't recognise Alicia here because she's got a mask on. And one of the great things, I'll come to that in a minute, about studying bioethics was the freedom to pick a topic for my PhD. I struggled because there were so many things I was interested in. In the end, I wrote my PhD about ethical issues associated with outsourcing clinical trials to developing countries. And this is interesting for 2 reasons, or the trade-off is interesting. So we talked about kind of deontology and utilitarianism. So these were trials where you couldn't run these clinical trials in rich countries because the companies wanted them to be placebo-controlled. And they wanted that because that creates less noise and gets the data they need more quickly. But because there was already treatment, HIV treatment protocols in wealthy countries, you couldn't withhold that treatment from 50% of the participants. But you could do them in poor countries where there was no treatment because you weren't holding anything back that they would get otherwise. So on the one hand, from a deontological perspective, many people objected and said using people's poverty to create products for pharmaceutical companies is a form of exploitation, and it's not treating people with due respect. But on the other hand, from a consequentialist perspective, more people were getting medicine than otherwise. So if you stopped the trials, actually fewer people were getting medicine. It's not like anyone else was coming in to fill that void. So I still find this such an interesting and difficult ethical issue. These are my lovely supervisors, both in Melbourne and Richard at Imperial College London. So one of the cool things I got to do from Monash was go on a trip to Geneva, an internship with the World Health Organization. And Geneva was an absolute blast. I had so much fun in Geneva. And I worked on 2 reports. The first was around gene patenting, and then my boss, Alina, went back to Canada, and the WHO surprisingly ran me back and said, would you like to step in and take over for the next report on our schedule, the small topic of medical genetic services in developing countries, all ethical, legal and social issues. Would you give responsibility for this to a 24-year-old with an undergrad degree in science and like 1.5 years study in bioethics? That is what one of the reviewers called and asked me directly when he read the first version of my report, followed by, this is so bad, it's going to set back the interests of developing genetic services in low-income countries by 20 years, and children will die. Now, that was a necessary correction. I appreciated, I cried, but I appreciated that feedback, and we knuckled down, and then I had 6 months to do it because that was the only amount of leave I could get off my away from my PhD. He did at the end of the process call back and say he had never seen a document improve so much. I actually had to go back and look at this, and I was like, it seriously says Angela Ballantyne had primary responsibility for the writing and review process for this report. It's like, those were crazy times. Okay, so one of the more interesting than that was this meeting. Now, I wasn't running this meeting, I was just an observer. This was a meeting trying to decide on how to equitably distribute access to HIV/AIDS treatment. This was in the early 2000s. It's hard to remember now what a catastrophe HIV/AIDS was at that point. It had already killed more people than World War I. It was on track to kill more people than all of World War II. At this stage, there were 6 million people in need of immediate access to antiretroviral therapy, and about 8% had access. So the UNAIDS and WHO got together and set a really ambitious target of getting 3 million people on treatment by the end of 2025. And they brought together this group of international experts and philosophers to try and decide, how do we pick the 3 million out of the 6 million who we're going to try and save? And most of you aren't bioethicists, so I won't tell you the names, but I was fangirling really hard. There were like amazing people in that room. It was very exciting. And the philosophers who came, I thought, presented not the right answer, but useful models for how you could decide who to prioritise. The health and human rights people, whenever they got a turn to speak, said, well, everyone has a right to health. Health is a human right. You can't intentionally deny 3 million people access to medicines they need. I was like, oh my God. Like, are you kidding me? Now, that's my interpretation of events. I might be simplifying it, but that's certainly how I read it. And that put me off human rights as a model for a long time. Because it felt to me like you're prioritising your own kind of ethical purity over actually problem solving. Like, the whole point of this meeting was to come here, and even if we got 3 million people on therapy, that would be amazing, right? And again, that really clarified for me that to do good ethical work, you have to get your hands dirty. And that's just the reality of living in a world with this sort of complex backdrop of inequity. So in particular, in terms of deciding, there were questions, for example, about how you balance utility and equity. You could, for example, if you wanted to get as many people on therapy as quickly as possible, put all of your resources into urban settings, which would be the most efficient. But there were existing health disparities where people in rural settings already were more disadvantaged. So do you want to spend like 80% of your budget on efficiency in urban settings, but keep 20% aside and use that to try and address equity issues, or 50-50? This issue about utility and equity is something that's run through a lot of my work subsequently. So over here is a blog post. It's probably the most read piece of work I've ever done about ICU triage. And this was a question during COVID. If you've got limited ICU beds and you're trying to decide who to prioritise into those, if you just prioritise the healthiest patients with the greatest likelihood of surviving, you're going to save the most lives, but you're going to reinforce existing health disparities because certain demographics who would still benefit from ICU but are in that slightly second tier come with comorbid conditions, for example. So are we interested just in how many lives we save, or also whose lives we save? Similar type of analysis to this paper that came out last year, which was looking at an AI screening tool for diabetic retinopathy in Singapore. This AI screening tool was more accurate than the existing kind of human-based model. But because of disparities in the data used to train the model, it was particularly accurate for majority ethnic populations and one in particular marginalised ethnic population had less data because they were excluded from the health system, so it was less effective for that population. So again, you're trying to decide, how do we balance utility versus fairness for these particular groups? How can bioethics help with these kinds of problems? Bioethics, in my view, is not there to tell you the right answer. I'm often in meetings where people say, there's a bioethicist in the room, she'll tell us what to do. And it's like, I can tell you what I think, right? But what I think is just what I think from a very particular position. For me, bioethics acts in service to medicine and science, both of which are public goods. And my job is to help people in those areas deliver their public goods. It's not going to help you just to have the world run by Angela, right? Those are social institutions, and we need to... we can discuss that at karaoke later. We need to be able to work together, right? So it's like, what rules can we agree on, and what compromises can we agree on, and what can we tolerate in terms of living together? So bioethics, what it can do is it can help you describe the problem accurately. Often the problem is misdiagnosed. So for example, this paper I wrote about clinical data ownership. People often talk about data ownership as though the patient owns the data, therefore it's theirs, and therefore using it without their consent is a problem. So in this paper I was interrogating, well, what does that mean to say it's the patient's data? Because that can mean linguistically different things. It can mean the data is about the patient, it can mean the data is in relationship to the patient, or it can mean the data is the property of the patient. Like, Scout is my daughter, that doesn't automatically mean she is my property, and you can use her if I sell her to you, for example. So the data, if we can correctly characterise the problem, what I argued was actually it doesn't make sense to think that patients own the data in a property sense because they haven't produced the data. If anyone's produced the data, it's the doctors who have written that, right? There's no way patients have the expertise to produce those medical records. But the data is about the patients, and therefore the patients have interest in that data. But that leads you down quite a different set of solutions if you think through an interest model as opposed to a consent and control and ownership model. It can help you understand your own reasoning. I think that a lot of moral distress and suffering, particularly in medicine, not a lot. Some of it can be alleviated if you have a better understanding of the reasoning that got you to this position. There is an enormous difference between having a gut instinct that I'm going to do A versus having thought through, I'm going to do A, I have carefully considered all the alternatives, I've weighed them, I've considered those objections, and on balance I still think A is the best option. Because there's solidity to that, and that solidity is protective when you have to deal, for example, with the harms of option A. It also helps you understand ethical conflict. We actually all use all those types of reasoning, virtue ethics, deontology, utilitarianism, all the time. But in any given argument, sometimes the source of that argument is someone is thinking about consequences and benefits, and someone's thinking about rules and rights. And so a lot of the debate, for example, around COVID mandates operated on that level. It's like speaking French to Russian. You are never going to resolve that on a principled level. You're going to have to use different models around negotiation and compromise to come to a solution. If you understand your reasoning, it's much easier to be transparent and to communicate. So I think bioethics has a really important role in facilitating structured discourse. Epistemic humility is the idea that we are humble about the limits of our knowledge. We are open to revising that. We're open to learning and new knowledge. If you're really convinced you're right about something, you're much less receptive to new knowledge and you're much less likely to change your mind. In fact, changing your mind about ethics is actually really hard. Most of our ethical principles we hold very close to our chest. Research shows that if you give someone good evidence that counteracts their initial position, say on vaccines or tobacco or euthanasia, they don't become more flexible in their reasoning. Often they double down. And the reason that happens is because our opinions are our babies, and when someone attacks them, we want to attack back, right? We want to defend them. So creating space for flexibility of reasoning is really important. I think in terms of global challenges, other than climate change, the thing that worries me most is increasing polarisation, lack of social cohesion, and growing mistrust. And the best thing we can do to address that is to keep talking to each other in a safe and respectful way. And this is everything from being on committees and being in rooms, talking to families and patients, but it's also little things like every time we share a little political meme that dehumanises a politician we disagree with, that seems relatively harmless, right? But to me, those are little barbs that tear the fabric of social cohesion, which is what's holding us all together. And part of what's tricky about ethics is that there's certain harms that are really measurable, and there's other harms that are much more indirect and immeasurable. So in COVID, it was really easy to keep track of how many people in aged care facilities were dying. It was really difficult to quantify the harm to preschoolers and teenagers from long periods of social isolation. So I think when we think about social cohesion and trust, we need to be really protective of maintaining respectful dialogue a lot of the time. This is not my work, but this is work I use quite often, is the Alderman Trust Barometer. Really interesting if you want to go and have a look. So the Alderman Trust Barometer measures both trust in different institutions. There are 4 main social institutions: government, NGOs, business and media. And so there's 2 spectrums. Do people in the public perceive those institutions as competent, and do they perceive them as ethical and acting in their best interests? You can see in New Zealand that none of those institutions are deemed both ethical and competent. Now, context is really important because I do a lot of work in Singapore. It really matters whether we're talking about rolling out COVID mandates or AI tools that challenge trust in this context versus in the context of Singapore, where all 4 of those institutions are in the top right quadrant and all are perceived as ethical and trustworthy. So that's my pitch for you today. Keep talking to people, treat people with respect, and really protect that social cohesion network of trust. Okay, to finish the story, after I was at Monash in Geneva, I went to Flinders Medical School for a year. I worked with Wendy Rogers there. That was really important because philosophy is quite male dominated, and it was really important to me to have female mentors, particularly someone who had raised children and also had a career. I went to Yale. Yale was really pretty. My husband had been to Oxford. I was really jealous. I was really pleased. I went to Yale. There was a lot more to Yale than that, but I'm going to leave it at that for tonight. I got pregnant at Yale, came home and had Scout. I got this job at the University of Otago, Wellington. I've been here for 15 years. I thought it was going to be really easy. I thought ethics is the most interesting part of what you medical students do. This will be a walk in the park. It was a rude shock to find that medical students hate ethics. Not because they are unethical, but because they're very busy trying to download all the critical information they need. This paper really clarified the situation for me and what I was actually dealing with. So this was a paper that reflected on the first 7 years of Auckland's Clinical Ethics Committee. They put in print: an ethicist was not appointed as a permanent member because it was feared this could lead to protracted and unproductive discussions. Amazing. This never fails to bring me joy. If I'm grumpy, I just look at this. I love this for 2 reasons. One, I just think that's amazing. It's not like you'd set up an expert cardiology group and say, the last thing we want on this group is cardiologists. But I also love it because I just so clearly had no idea what I was doing. This is what I mean about, like, we're so busy often working so hard at something and we're like digging the hole in entirely the wrong spot. So I thought I turned up to play Monopoly and I was like playing pickleball. The medical students are the ones that taught me this, and the medical students are the ones that taught me how to teach. Every year they told me what I was doing wrong, and they broke it down and told me what I needed to do differently. And I really enjoy teaching now. And it's a huge credit to the medical students and their capacity to share their knowledge. Most of my life has been a balance for the last 15 years between 50% professional work and 50% looking after these monkeys. And for those that know, the questionable addition of Colin the dog. This has often been a very literal juggle. This is me with my son Monty on my head trying to edit. This is about 5:30 in the morning, trying to edit a chapter for a colleague for a book we were working on. There are various people that make that balance work. First is my dear colleague Ben Gray, who's watching this from France. Bonjour. Ben has been incredibly generous at bringing me into his clinical world and sharing the nuance and the complexity of that clinical space, and being really vulnerable with me about the difficulty of making decisions with patients. When I'm juggling a lot of balls, I'm often dropping them. If I drop them, Ben picks them up And if they break, he never gets mad at me. So I really appreciate Ben. I've also had two amazing head of departments, Sue Pullen and Lynn McBain. It's a huge credit to both of you that I have managed to reach Professor while working part-time. There's a real vibe in the Department of General Practice about focusing on family. And so, for example, when I was asked to stand for President of the International Association of Bioethics, I asked Sue's advice. And Sue said, I don't think you really need to do that. You've got young children, there'll be plenty of other opportunities. Now, I didn't take Sue's advice, and I did take the role, but it was hugely permissive for me to know that I was in an environment where I wasn't being pushed and I could move at my own pace. Obviously, this man carries the slack all the time when I'm off gallivanting around the world. And I have many, many other people who hold my children both spiritually and physically. In particular, my mother, to come back to this point. So my mother is an enormous support. She looks after the kids, she cooks them food, she picks them up. But my mother is also basically like a version of ChatGPT before there was ChatGPT, but with none of the sycophantic tendencies. So this is something I found in my special box, which was an essay I'd written in second year at university and on embryos, actually, in my science degree. You can see acknowledgements, Jean Ballantyne. What used to happen is that I would handwrite a paper. My mother was an excellent touch typist. I would read the paper out loud. She would produce the typed report, perfect grammar, perfect spelling, perfectly formatted, references included, but she would also quiz me on it as I spoke. So she'd say, well, you've got no topic sentence for that paragraph. And why are you introducing this concept in the last third of the essay? You need to introduce that in the introduction. So that was enormously helpful in terms of refining my ability to express an argument. The other thing that was fun about looking through all my old box of special things was challenging narratives that I thought were established. So I thought what happened was that I took the kids to Matilda in London when they were this age, and then they got really into musicals and shows, and they wanted to put on their own show when they came back. So somehow, Ryan and I ended up running a small amateur theatre group. However, if you go back to the photos of Ryan, and so this has actually led to multiple other shows, I sometimes get a small non-singing role. But if you go back to our photos, like 50% of our childhood photos, we are in costume. And I don't have time to show all of them to you. That's Ryan as the robot. All of the photos from our family, it's like we are always in costume all of the time, whether we are overseas, whether we're in theory are dressed up, whether we're at parties, whether we're out, whether we're at home. And I was like, I think the call is coming from inside the building. I think we might be the source rather than Matilda having been the source. Thank you to my crazy family for putting up with me. I am going to finish now, and I would like to finish with a love note from my daughter. To Angela, you are a really good person because you are really nice, really confident, and also really, really clever. Now, being a good parent, I asked for consent to use this, and I gave her all the information that a reasonable child in that child's circumstances would need to know to make an informed decision. She gave conditional approval, so long as I said that she wrote this when she was 6, and given the indeterminacy of personal identity over time, she cannot confirm that these statements reflect her current views on the topic. The topic being me, her mother. Okay. Also, being the biggest pain in the arse academic, I'm going to offer you a critical appraisal of this letter. We'll start at the bottom. You're really, really clever. Honestly, I actually don't think I'm that clever. And I don't think you need to be that clever to live a meaningful life and do meaningful work. I think there's quite a fetishisation of intellectualism at universities in a way that is both gendered and kind of unhelpful. You are really confident. I am confident, but I'm just good at faking confidence, which is all anyone is doing. You are really nice. I had a really interesting would you rather conversation with my girlfriends at high school, which my sister and I have discussed many times. It was, would you rather be called nice or a bitch? And I was completely gobsmacked because all my friends chose nice. And I was like, that is so lame. Like, I would so much rather be, I mean, it's not the thing I'd most choose to be called, but like, a bitch at least has like agency and power and personality. So I would like to say, it's taken me 25 years to get here, probably longer actually. I would now really like to be thought of as nice. And It is a really good day if I have managed to be nice to the people around me. I like the idea of manaakitanga. How do you ensure that your engagements with other people increase their mana? You are a really, really good person, and this is what we will finish on. So I've thought about this a lot for the last 6 weeks, and I regret to inform you that I don't have a conclusion. I get that that's quite disappointing to come to a professor of ethics lecture and find out they don't even know what they think about whether they're a good person. In defence, I would say a few things. One, we should hold on to not knowing. It's okay to be in the space of not being sure about something. Once we make up our mind about something, that shuts down our intellectual flexibility. It's actually really good to allow yourself to be in the space of not knowing. Like any good argument, there are questions on both, there's evidence on both sides. On the one hand, if you had known me as a teenager, you would see the irony in the fact that it is me who's grown up to be a professional ethicist. As a more current example, one of the great joys of this lecture has been getting to watch the discomfort of my sister having to watch me give this lecture. And not just now, I've had anticipatory pleasure about that for several weeks. I don't think a good person would feel that way about someone else's discomfort. On the other hand, I think part of the difficulty is, this is like the generic versus the particular, I care a lot about whether the particular decisions I've made are good decisions. I said something to a med student the other day and I'm like, I don't think I got that quite right. But the kind of, are you a good person is such a big question. And it's really hard to see ourselves objectively, right? We're always seeing ourselves through our own mental architecture. So perhaps it's easier to see goodness in other people than it is to see in yourself. Oh, I've made it so far. Which was leading me to finish by saying, perhaps the best evidence of whether you're a good person is the quality of the people who choose to be around you. And I think I am incredibly blessed to have such good friends. And my sister would tell me friendship isn't a competition, which is true. But hypothetically, if it were, I would win. Because I have the kindest, most thoughtful friends. I have the best colleagues who are humble and talented and get on with making the world a better place all the time. And I have the sweetest, most endearing students. So thank you, good people, for being in my circle and for joining me tonight.